اعذروني على تطفلي لإدارة هذه الجلسة. هذه الجلسة كان ينبغي أن تدار من قبل الدكتور زيد عيادات، نائب رئيس الجامعة الأردنية ومدير مركز دراسات الاستراتيجية فيها، لكن لا ندري لسبب ما، لطارئ ما اعتذر، وأجد نفسي يعني في موقع يعني من سيدير هذه الجلسة. ومن غرائب الصدف أن هذه الثانية منذ أن بدأ تعاوننا مع مؤسسة كونراد أديناور قبل 20 سنة، بنجلس أنا والريبريزنتيف يعني دايركتور أوف كونراد أديناور شتيفتونج على بني الوحدة. المرة الماضية كان هو مودريتر وأنا سبيكر، المرة هاي أنا مودريتر وهو سبيكر. هذا لا يحصل دائما يعني يسي، لكنه حصل يعني. على أي حال، موضوعنا اليوم أو موضوع هذه الجلسة يستكمل ما بدأناه، ولكن هذه المرة بالتوقف مع شريك أساسي للأردن على الساحة الدولية، وشريك سياسي واقتصادي، وأشدد على اقتصادي وسياسي بنفس القدر، ليس لأن أوروبا تطلع بأدوار كبيرة في منطقة الشرق الأوسط، ولكن بالإشارة إلى المروحة الواسعة من الاتفاقات والتفاهمات السياسية بين الأردن والاتحاد الأوروبي، بين الأردن وبريطانيا. هناك مساحة واسعة من الالتقاء، إن في الموضوع الفلسطيني الإسرائيلي، حيث يتفق الجانبان على حل الدولتين، ويتفق الجانبان أيضا على دعم الأونروا، ويتفق الجانبان أيضا على الحاجة لإطلاق مسار سياسي ذي مغزى، ويتفق الجانبان كذلك على تنشيط وتفعيل الرباعية الدولية، وعدم ترك الأمور للوساطة الأمريكية المنفردة في هذا الملف. بالمعنى الاقتصادي، أعتقد أن أوروبا شريك أكبر للأردن، داعم رئيس ومزود رئيس للمساعدات، وطرأت على العلاقات الأردنية الأوروبية تطورات مهمة، سواء في الإطار الثنائي أو مع الاتحاد الأوروبي في إطار سياسة الجوار neighborhood policy، واللي الأردن انخرط فيها منذ البداية، وقبلها في إطار الشراكة يعني الأوروبية المتوسطية، أو ما عرف باسم برشلونة بروسيس. بريطانيا العلاقة معها ربما تكون أقدم وأعرق، الدولة المنتدبة على الأردن، والدولة التي رافقت تأسيس الدولة من بواكيرها، وبالتالي يعني للأردن وبريطانيا علاقات خاصة. وأميز الآن عندما نتحدث عن أوروبا، بدنا نتحدث عن أوروبا وعن بريطانيا بعد البريكزيت، لأننا أمام كيانين مستقلين في هذا المجال. خلال كل المراحل التي وجد الأردن نفسه فيها يواجه بعض التحديات في علاقته مع إسرائيل أو مع الولايات المتحدة، كان الدور الأوروبي دائما داعما وإيجابيا بالنسبة للأردن، بل ووفرت يعني أوروبا مظلة لعمان بالذات، يعني في ظل إدارة ترامب التي قلنا أن الأردن عانى منها ما عانى بسبب سياساتها أو ما وصف بالبارادايم شيفت في نقاشات اليوم وفي نقاشات المؤتمر السابق الذي اعتمدته إدارة ترامب عفوا، في النظر للصراع الفلسطيني الإسرائيلي، متجاهلة عن وعي أن ذلك إنما يلحق ضررا فادحا بالمصالح الأردنية العليا في الحل النهائي للقضية الفلسطينية، وهي كما قال أحد المتحدثين صباح هذا اليوم: كل المصالح الأردنية الرئيسية في الحل النهائي أرجئت بموجب أوسلو، ولا زالت حتى يومنا هذا قيد الإرجاء. دعوني أن ألفت إلى الدور الذي اطلعت به رباعية ميونخ والتي ضمت ألمانيا وفرنسا والأردن ومصر في الفترة التي بدا فيها أن إدارة ترامب تغرد خارج السرب وتغادر الفريم ورك حل الدولتين two state solution framework، وتغادر أيضا فكرة الريجونال فريم ورك لحل القضية الفلسطينية، والذي عانى تاريخيا يعني الأردن ومصر، إلا في عهد ترامب انتقل الاهتمام والتركيز صوب بعض العواصم الخليجية على حساب يعني الدور الأردني التقليدي والدور المصري التقليدي في المسألة الفلسطينية. رباعية ميونخ كانت واحدة من وظائفها الأساسية هي الحفاظ على إبقاء خيار حل الدولتين حيا، يعني في مواجهة هذا التجاهل من قبل الإدارة الأمريكية. اليوم للأسف نرى أن البعض يعتقد أن دور هذه الرباعية قد انتهى بمجيء إدارة بايدن. أعتقد شخصيا أن دور هذه الرباعية ينبغي أن يتكثف لاستنقاذ حل الدولتين، لأننا نسمع من إدارة بايدن الكثير عن حل الدولتين، ولا نرى ما يتخطى إجراءات بناء الثقة بين السلطة وإسرائيل أو تعميق التهدئة بين قطاع غزة وإسرائيل. لذلك نشاط كثيف من الرباعية، رباعية ميونخ، أعتقد أنه مطلوب الآن من أجل دفع مسار حل الدولتين والسعي لترجمة الرؤية إلى حقائق، إلى وقائع، إلى مسار ذي مغزى قابل للحياة، قابل للاستمرار، محدد بجداول زمنية. هذا إن كان فعلا القوم جادون يعني في حديثهم عن حل الدولتين. إذن نحن نتحدث عن شريك أساسي بالمعنى السياسي، بالمعنى الاقتصادي، بالمعنى التجاري، بالمعنى المالي والمساعدات، بالمعنى الأمني في الحرب على الإرهاب. ولدينا على الأرض الأردنية الآن يعني وحدات من عدة جيوش أوروبية منخرطة في الحرب على الإرهاب، وهذا رفع وتيرة التعاون بين الأردن والدول المعنية، أعني بالذكر ألمانيا بشكل خاص، أعني أيضا فرنسا، أعني بريطانيا، ويعني عدد أقل يعني أو عدد آخر من الدول له حضور أقل في هذا المجال. والحرب على الإرهاب ما زالت من وجهة نظر أردنية على أقل تقدير يعني موضوع أساسي ويكتسب أهمية استثنائية، والإرهاب ما زال يشكل تحديا كبيرا، إذ يعني تشير التقديرات إلى وجود 10,000 مقاتل من داعش ما زالوا يفعلون ويعملون ويتحركون في البادية الشام وفي الأراضي السورية والعراقية على حد سواء. ودعونا نتذكر أن الذين احتلوا نصف سوريا ونصف العراق من داعش في 2014 كانوا أقل من هذا العدد، كانوا أقل من هذا العدد بكثير. على أي حال يعني هذا موضوع أعتقد سيلقي ضيوفنا الكرام الضوء عليه في هذا المجال. محدثنا الأول هو الدكتور ألان جورج، ونحن نسعد بوجوده معنا للمرة الثانية. والدكتور ألان جورج هو يعني باحث رئيس سابق في سانت أنتوني كوليدج أكسفورد يونيفرسيتي، وهو أيضا باحث زائر يعني سابق في جامعة لندن كينغز كوليدج، وهو الآن يعني ربما قريبا يعني يعاود يعني عمله في الكينغز كوليدج في هذا المجال، يعني كما فهمنا منه في هذا المجال. أرجو تصحيح بعض المعلومات عن الدكتور ألان جورج الواردة في برنامج عمل هذا المؤتمر بناء على ما قلته. دكتور ألان، معك بين 15 إلى 20 دقيقة لتجمل لنا مداخلتك حول المحاور الرئيسية في العلاقات الأردنية الأوروبية كما تراها. تفضل.
Thank you very much. First, the introduction was correct. Thank you. At the outset, may I take this opportunity to thank the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung and the Al-Quds Center for Political Studies for organizing this interesting conference and for inviting me as a speaker. This present session concerns relations between Jordan and the EU, characterized as economic and political partnership. Based on an association agreement signed in 2002 and a series of subsequent accords, these relations have been warm, lengthy, and consistent. On its website, the EU's delegation to Amman affirms that Jordan is a key partner for the EU at the global, regional, and bilateral levels, in particular due to its important role in promoting stability, moderation, and interfaith tolerance in the Middle East. The website adds, the EU and Jordan share common values and have common interests, including the promotion of peace, stability, and socio-economic development. Describing relations as very good, it lists a host of specific areas of bilateral cooperation: support for macroeconomic stability and sustainable and knowledge-based growth, I'm quoting from the website, strengthening democratic governance, the rule of law and human rights, encouragement of regional stability and security, including counterterrorism, migration and mobility, and so on. On the economic front, the EU is Jordan's most important partner, accounting for 14.8% of the kingdom's total trade last year, compared with 13.3% for Saudi Arabia, 13.1% for the USA, and 12.4% for China. But trade flows are skewed very heavily in the EU's favor. In 2020, Jordan's exports to the EU totaled only 361 million euros, while imports were 8 times larger at 2,997 million euro. While the trade relationship is skewed heavily in the EU's favor, the opposite is true of aid flows. The OECD Development Assistance Committee records that Jordan received $2.8 billion in aid in 2019, the latest year for which full data is available. Of this, $173 million came from EU institutions, $459 million from Germany, $94 million from France, and $176 million from the UK, which was then in its final year as an EU member. EU institutions, plus Germany and France, thus accounted for 26% of all Jordan's aid receipts last year. Arguably, aid flows are the bedrock of the EU-Jordanian relationship. Budget security has been a perennial, overarching Jordanian objective that has had significant foreign policy implications. According to the World Bank, aid receipts in 2019 accounted for about 24% of all Jordanian government expenses. One could reasonably assert that the EU funds a quarter of Jordanian government spending. So much for the broad context. When I was approached to deliver this address, 5 session topics were identified. I'll deal with each of these in turn, albeit briefly given the time limits. First, how do EU states view Jordan's position and role amid the rapid regional and international changes? I have to say that I detect no substantial evolution in EU attitudes towards Jordan, at least for the moment. Located at a key geographical crossroads in a region where the West has ever fewer friends, the kingdom continues to be perceived as a valued, fundamentally pro-Western ally in the struggle against religious and nationalist extremism and terrorism, and in the continued, albeit increasingly quixotic, search for Israeli-Palestinian peace. EU attitudes could soon change, however, albeit marginally. To date, the kingdom has largely supported the US in its ongoing conflict with Iran, but Jordan's recent cautious and preliminary overtures to Tehran could raise hackles, in Washington especially, but also possibly in Europe. I'm reminded how much Western opprobrium was heaped on Jordan as a result of its cordial links with Saddam's Iraq. Equally, the EU's position on Iran has never simply mirrored that of the US. In my view, the EU, and perhaps especially the post-Brexit EU, given the UK's very close alignment with Washington, is unlikely to respond negatively to any Jordanian rapprochement with Tehran. The so-called New Sham project could be a different matter. The project involves Jordan's closer alignment with Iraq and Egypt, partly with a view to distancing itself from Saudi Arabia, whose relations with Jordan have been troubled since the Prince Hamza affair. But Baghdad is close to Iran, and Iraq has become a key arena for the Washington-Tehran conflict. Washington, and possibly Europe, albeit to a much lesser extent, could worry about this potential further expansion of Iranian influence. Potentially, however, the New Sham project could include Syria, with which Jordan has been re-establishing normal ties. And this normalization could well facilitate violations by Jordanian entities of US and EU sanctions against the Assad regime. This would likely become a major issue in Jordan's relations, both with the US and EU. As an aside, Basma earlier today mentioned the distancing of Europe from the region as a result of populist nationalist governments, for example, in Hungary, Poland. I'm not so sure about that. I would point out that the Middle East is Europe's direct neighbor, and however populist and nationalist you are, you can't ignore issues like migration. This comes right home. So I don't think there'll be a distancing by Europe because of political changes within Europe. The second topic raised for me to address here was how Jordanian-EU cooperation in the war on terror might be enhanced. I have to say, it's unclear to me what significant specific steps the two sides might take towards that objective. Cooperation, not least in intelligence sharing, is already extremely close. It may be, though, that the biggest challenge in this field will be indirect. The economic situation and general living standards and political freedoms within the kingdom. Terrorism and extremism thrive on deprivation and marginalization, especially perhaps where non-violent channels of political expression are limited or closed. Given Jordan's poor resource base and limited domestic economic capacity, Jordanian stability, very much including the stability of its monarchy, depends on an adequate influx of foreign aid and investment. Without doubt, more funding from Europe would enhance Jordanian stability and assist its struggle against extremism. So too would measures to enhance local democracy and accountability. I note in this regard that the EU's Amman delegation website declares, in apparent criticism of the kingdom's elite, the European Union stands by the Jordanian people in their ongoing efforts to achieve democracy, respect for human rights, social justice, security, and socio-economic development. The third of the topics suggested for me to cover is the UK and Jordan after Brexit and AUKUS. Will there be any developments? First, Brexit. Facing economic pressures resulting both from the COVID pandemic and from Brexit itself, the UK scaled down the proportion of national income allocated for foreign aid from 0.7% to 0.5%. UK Foreign Office statistics show that bilateral aid to Jordan fell from £131 million in 2019 to only £81 million in 2020. The concern in Amman must be that the trend will continue. In my view, however, that is unlikely. London's ties with Jordan run deep, and Jordan is seen as being especially critical to the UK's concerns over terrorism and migration. In any event, late last month, London announced an intention to restore the 0.7% figure when the UK economy is improved. Proponents of Brexit, many apparently nostalgic for the days of empire, declared that it would make Britain great again. They believed it would allow the UK to play a more assertive role internationally. In reality, little has changed. the UK's diminished economic circumstances and consequently limited military and soft power resources severely restrict its scope for any significant expansion of its global profile. And such steps as have been taken have come, as before, in close collaboration with Washington. The most significant was the formation of the Indo-Pacific AUKUS Security Pact with Australia and the US, which aims to counter perceived Chinese expansionism. The past year has also seen an increase in UK-Japanese military, particularly naval, cooperation. For Jordan, the worry must be that the increasing US and UK focus on the Pacific and Asia will distract these two key Western allies from Middle Eastern issues of immediate concern to Jordan, not least the Palestine conflict. Equally, as I shall mention in a moment, it seems to me that Jordan's patience, and here I refer both to the general populace and the authorities, with the West's ongoing feebleness on Palestine is wearing thin. To that extent, a weaker engagement in the region by the US and UK might not make much difference. Is there an opportunity to build Jordan-EU positions on the two-state solution and UNRWA to take more initiatives, especially with the US shifting its focus from the Palestinian-Israeli conflict? That is the fourth of my 5 topics. I don't think it helps to beat about the bush. Simply put, the two-state solution is dead in the water and beyond hope of revival. I know there are several in the room who may disagree with that, but that is my view. The Lapid-Bennett government is as committed to colonization as its predecessors. Just days ago, it approved the construction of a further 3,000 plus homes in illegal West Bank settlements. Israel long ago abandoned any even pretense at the two-state notion. As always, only Washington has the power, at least in theory, to influence Israel, and the EU remains a bystander. Relief at the demise of the Trump administration and its absurd deal of the century is entirely understandable. So is relief that last year's so-called Abraham Accords between Israel on the one hand and Bahrain, the UAE, Sudan and Morocco on the other are no longer seen in Washington, at least to the same extent, as some sort of substitute for Palestinian-Israeli peace. But such relief should not be confused with confidence that the Biden administration's words about a two-state solution will prove any more meaningful than similar declarations from other US administrations stretching back decades. For the EU and for Jordan, the two-state solution remains official policy, but it is going nowhere and has nowhere to go. Indeed, Amman's disenchantment on Palestine surely explains in part its incipient reorientation towards Iraq, Iran, Egypt, and Syria. My fifth and final topic is whether there is any scope for a reactivation of the Munich Quartet, comprising Jordan, Egypt, France, and Germany, that was established on the sidelines of the Munich Security Conference in February 2020. It was formed to keep the two-state solution alive at a time when the Trump administration was launching its fatally flawed deal of the century. In light of my earlier comments, my position should be no surprise. The two-state solution is simply a non-starter, and the Munich Quartet will remain moribund. To summarize, the EU-Jordanian relationship, lengthy, stable, and of great benefit to both sides, will likely adjust relatively comfortably to foreseeable changes in the region, or indeed in Europe, but with two possible exceptions. On Palestine, both sides remain officially wedded to a two-state solution that has become hopeless. How Brussels and Amman reposition themselves in light of that reality could unsettle the relationship. Potentially even more significant would be any busting of EU sanctions against Damascus arising from enhanced Jordanian commercial links with its northern neighbor. I think that does my 20 minutes.
Thank you so much, Alan, for this well-articulated, insightful, direct answer for our 5 topics in the agenda. I think For the Q&A session, maybe you elaborate more on what's so-called this new Jordanian-Iranian rapprochement, yani, because this is yani, something yani, many Jordanians will not agree yani, on this assumption, since we are talking almost about one phone call between the two foreign ministers. Yani, this is one. And from my personal experience, we're supposed to have some Iranian colleagues to participate in session, but we couldn't get them a security clearance to, to enter the country. What kind of new rapprochement between Jordan and Iran you are talking yani, about? I think this is important. Of course, I am aware about some rumors in the town about back channel security contacts, Baghdad channels, parallel to the Saudi-Iranian channel, but there is no information about that. This is one, I think maybe we need more elaboration. And part of it also about Syria. We didn't say here in Jordan that we got a green light from Biden administration to normalize with Syria, but at least we didn't have a red flag from the White House. We call it yellow or orange light that we got from DC while we starting this new approach towards Syria. Is that worrying for the EU as well? Cannot we talk about also a yellow flag from the EU for Jordan to proceed with its new rapprochement toward Syria? This is a follow-up to Iran issue. In your presentation and in the previous session about U.S.-Jordan relationship, what is missing is human rights and democracy parameter in the bilateral relationship. Nobody even mentioned that as if it is one of the parameters for Jordan-U.S. relationship or for Jordan-EU relationship. Is democracy and the human right is not a parameter anymore? It is replaced by security, stability, war against terrorism. This is really something it's important really to elaborate more around it. Our second speaker, Paul إسبر. بول هو أستاذ في العلوم السياسية، متخصص في قضايا الشرق الأوسط، يركز أساساً على المشرق. الدكتوراه تبعته من جامعة سيدني كان عنوانها من هم الأردنيون؟ Citizen Subject، موضوعات المواطنة، عبد الله الثاني. this is my bad translation for the thesis title. مهتم بشكل خاص في موضوع المواطنة. وهو الآن أستاذ أو يعمل باحث زائر في مركز الدراسات الآسيوية والأفريقية في جامعة المكسيك. Paul, the floor is yours. 15 minutes, is it enough for you?
إن شاء الله الخير يا أستاذ.
هذا بتحكي عربي أحسن مني.
راح بحكي بالإنجليزية بس بحكي عربي. نعم. وعندي on PowerPoint c'est aqui. And first of all, thank you very much to the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung مركز القدس للدراسات السياسية. To you, Ustaz Ayadet, and to everyone present in this conference, face-to-face and online. I'm very happy for this opportunity to speak to you all on the subject of Jordan and the European Union. When I received this invitation a week ago, and I found the 5 topics. There were 4 that I thought were of particular interest to me. And on the one hand, some of them can be answered quite quickly. So I will go through these 4 and then continue to the remainder of my presentation. How does the EU view Jordan's position and role? Inherently stable, amiable, and solid. AUKUS is an interesting situation for Jordan because on the one hand, it doesn't directly involve Jordan. AUKUS is in some ways a way for the Anglosphere, led by the United States of America, the United Kingdom, and including the junior partner, Australia, to pivot towards the Pacific and to contain China in a new model of the Cold War. And unless Jordan wishes in some way to openly join the containment of China, which I do not see as much of a possibility, I don't see AUKUS directly impacting Jordanian, European, and Jordanian United Kingdom relations. The bigger impact was Brexit, but already we have seen in economic negotiations, the UK and Jordan sign an association agreement which mirrors as much as possible the association agreement that Jordan previously had with the United Kingdom through the association agreement with the European Union. The Munich Quartet I will get to shortly. And the 4th point, is there an opportunity to build on joint Jordan and EU positions on the 2-state solution? The hopeful answer is yes, but it requires the breaking of the status quo. And how that may or may not happen, I will outline as we continue. So to begin with, as my colleague and predecessor, Dr. Alan George, already enunciated, Jordan and the EU have a long history of economic cooperation, goes back to the Barcelona Conference in 1995, and continues through with the exchanging of letters and the signing of association agreements based on trade, which in recent times has included the simplification of rules of origin for Jordanian products being exported into the Eurozone. But before we get to that subject and the politics of that scheme, what can we say about Munich? Well, the deal of the century is dead. Long live the status quo. It won't be any news to anyone present at this conference, but in order for Palestine to achieve its statehood, it needs to pass through a bureaucratic process within the United Nations according to the United Nations Charter. The process outlined by Article 4 notes that the admission of any such state to membership of the United Nations will be affected by a decision of the General Assembly upon the recommendation of the Security Council. And the procedure being that a state will submit its application to the Secretary General of the United Nations, who will then pass it to the Security Council. It will be debated. Admission must receive affirmative votes of 9 out of 15 members of the Council, and none of the 5 permanent members can have voted against the application. Already we can see the obstacle for Palestinian statehood. And this brings us to what could the Munich Quartet possibly do? In 2014, the European Parliament passed a non-binding vote supporting in principle recognition of a Palestinian statehood and the 2-state solution. But France and Germany as individual states are yet to recognize the state of Palestine. And this is one step that they could take to give the 2-state solution a shot of adrenaline and maybe, to paraphrase Dr. George, bring it out from being dead in the water. The likelihood of this occurring, if the status quo as we know it is maintained, is not much at all. But should there be a change, and we've already seen the leader of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, make a declaration that Israel has 1 year to withdraw from its settlements and come back to the table. Abbas has made similar proclamations in the past and not followed them through. And so there is every likelihood that his most recent declaration will not lead anywhere new. But there is a chance that it might. And if the playing field is altered, then it may re-energize the Munich Quartet, and in particular the role of France and Germany as the leaders of Europe and the European Union. And there is already officially groundwork for this to happen. The EU's position is for a two-state solution based on the 4th of June 1967 lines with equivalent land swaps as agreed, security arrangements for Palestinians that respect their sovereignty and show that the occupation is over, based on the 1967 borders, that is, not on 1948. And for the Israelis to protect and guarantee their security, a fair and just, realistic, and this is the key term, I think, where much deliberation will be had. What is a realistic solution to the refugee question and the fulfillment of aspirations regarding Jerusalem? It is important that the European Union takes some action on this, and Jordanian diplomats are working hard to try and push this forward. As we saw in the previous session, whilst it is welcome that the deal of the century is buried, at least for the term of this current president, President Biden's proclamations, most recently at the United Nations, do not give much confidence. As he said in his address, I continue to believe that a two-state solution is the best way to ensure Israel's future as a Jewish democratic state, living in peace alongside a viable, sovereign, and democratic Palestinian state. We are a long way from that goal at this moment. We must never allow ourselves to give up the possibility of progress, which essentially outlines that for this term, the Biden administration is happy to see the status quo maintained. And so it is on the shoulders of Jordan, the Arab League, and the EU and other partners around the world to keep the two-state solution alive, if indeed it remains viable. Now, Jordan's place within the EU on an economic basis is within the framework of the Southern Partnership, which includes, as you can see in the image, I hope the image is clear for all of you face-to-face in the conference, the southern states of the Mediterranean shoreline from Morocco to Syria. And as has already been eloquently articulated by Dr. George, there is a great imbalance between Jordanian and European Union trade relations. Jordan is the EU's 63rd biggest trade partner. 2.1% of Jordan's exports went to the European Union in 2020. For the EU is Jordan's biggest trading partner in contrast, and 14.7% of its trade in 2020 went to Jordan. 20.6% of Jordan's imports come from the EU, but trade with Jordan accounts for 0.01% of the EU's total trade in goods. And it stands to reason that in terms of GDP, Jordan's gross GDP of $43 billion US in 2020 is demonstrably less than the Europeans' aggregate GDP of $15 trillion US in 2020. Having said that, because of the nature of the Southern Partnership, Jordan is implicitly in competition with its Arab neighbors and brothers in the Arab League for access to the European market. And this is something that, in terms of inter-Arab trade, may provide problems for boosting intra-Arab trade. But what we can see here, just of the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business scores, is that Jordan is one of the top 3 performers of the Southern partners, along with Israel, Morocco, and Tunisia is just behind Jordan, in terms of improving the business climate and the investment climate within the country, with a score of 68.97 in 2019. And this data is shown here as well in a comparison with Jordan, Morocco, and Israel. Israel is the red line, Morocco is the middle line, and Jordan is the third from the top. What we see is that Jordan is fast converging in terms of the ease of doing business. And this intersects well with the EU's aid and business investment to Jordan that focuses on small to medium enterprises. And the Jordanian Business Council and other organizations within Jordan are working hard to improve that business climate, which will produce employment and further exports to the Eurozone. And this brings me to one of the main parts of my presentation, the rules of origin that was introduced in 2016 and amended in 2018, that allows Jordanian products to be more easily exported to the EU. And in 2016, there was a requirement inserted into the agreement to integrate Syrian refugees into the production line. At first, it was for a requirement of 25% after 3 years, but this has been reduced to 15%. The rules as they currently stand apply to 52 different product categories: textiles, garments, electrical products, chemical and plastic products, furniture, timber, and engineering. And 936 factories across the kingdom in all 18 of the industrial zones are included. It is valid until December 2030, 10 years, or more or less 10 years from now. And the relaxed rules of origin will be expanded once 200,000 jobs are created for Syrian refugees within the kingdom. Despite the promise, the take-up has been slow, in part because of the nature of the agreement and the employment integration requirement. So in 2018, before the amendment was introduced, only 3 companies had utilized the scheme. Only 70 factories within Jordan had been able to export directly to the Eurozone based on these new simplified rules of origin. The then president of the Jordanian Exporters Association, engineer Omar Abarwisher, commented that the labor integration requirement was the main obstacle for Jordanian businesses. However, there was an increase in the number and the value of exports that was sent to the Eurozone. 19.2 million euros of value were exported in 2018, and this increased to more than 55 million euros in 2019. In the first months of 2020, that 55 million euros was increased to 80 million euros, as more companies began to take up the opportunity thanks to the amendment. But now there's the question of marketing. And Iyad Abu Haltam, the head of the Made in Jordan campaign, has made this point in the past, that there's been a failure of public and private sectors to enter markets through marketing schemes and really selling Jordanian products and the quality of Jordanian products to the world. So I think that is a next step for Jordan in terms of improving its economic access to the Eurozone market. But the Syrian requirement sheds light on some really hard decisions that Jordan must make in relation to its hosting of the 1.3 million refugees and displaced Syrians. A few countries in the world have shouldered such a burden with such gravitas and with such moral courage as Jordan. And I don't think that the European Union and other countries around the world really gives Jordan enough credit for this, because this refugee population, just the Syrians, resembles 15% of Jordan's total population. The Jordan Response Plan, which has been a very open and transparent model for international collaborators to assist Jordan in supporting displaced Syrians, has been endemically underfunded. In 2019, 51% was funded. In 2020, 49.4% of the program was funded. By August this year, only 9.1% of the latest incarnation of the plan had been financed. And as the Ministry of Planning and International Cooperation in Jordan has noted, the GDP of Jordan would have grown by 3.1% faster, estimated, if Jordan did not have to divert its domestic resources towards maintaining the Syrian refugee population. But when we're just dealing with money, that's not the end of the world. But what about resources that are finite, such as water? I think that given the conditions outlined, Jordan needs to be careful about how it engages with the EU in economic terms, and perhaps the rise of China and East Asian economies may assist in alleviating some of this. Because what is Jordan's competitive advantage vis-a-vis its neighbors and the neighbors who are competitors for market share as part of the Southern Partnership? And how much of an incentive are agreements such as the simplified rules of origin for sustaining Jordan's domestic response as a host country for Syrian refugees? Jordan is ranked 5th in the world for water stress.
2 minutes left, please.
2 minutes? Excellent. Thank you very much. In 2020, Nature reported that Jordan is overpumping from 10 of its 12 aquifers, and groundwater across the kingdom is being drawn out at twice the replenishment rate. In 2019, it was suggested by Al-Ahad and by the Jordan Times, two daily newspapers in the kingdom, that up to half of pumped water is lost through leakages and theft. A lot of work has gone into replacing and updating the water logistics network, and that has to be said. But still, these are some serious concerns. And when we look at just between 2006 and 2015, the Ministry of Water noted that, and Water and Immigration noted that consumption had increased. Domestic consumption went from 291.4 million cubic meters of water to 456.5. And this is much greater in 2015 than the industry component. Agriculture still absorbs more water, that is true, but the domestic consumption of water in Jordan has risen exponentially along with the population, which has doubled in the last 20 years. So for that, I apologize, I do not have solutions, but rather questions. And I want to say shukran jazilan, ana ktir mamnoon, muchas gracias, y thank you.
شكرا جزيلا بول على هذه المداخلة. يعني أنت الأبعد عنا جغرافيا، من المكسيك تتحدث، ولكن يبدو من مداخلتك أنك الأقرب يعني جغرافيا. دخلت في عدد من الملفات المهمة، سواء في موضوع العلاقة الأردنية الأوروبية والعوائق والفرص التي توفرها الاتفاقات الثنائية في مجال التبادل التجاري، ثم في قضية اللاجئين وقضية المياه، عناوين مهمة يجب أن تكون على أجندة العلاقات الثنائية بين الأردن والاتحاد الأوروبي وبين الأردن وبريطانيا كذلك. المتحدث الثالث توبياس بورك. Tobias Bork is a research fellow for Middle East Security Studies at the International Security Studies Department at RASI. His main research interests include the international relations of the Middle East and specifically the foreign, defense, and security policies of Arab states, particularly the Gulf monarchies, as well as European, especially German and the British engagement with the Middle East. Tobias holds a PhD in Middle East politics at the University of Exeter. His thesis examined the foreign policies of Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Qatar from 2011 to 2020. Tobias, the floor is yours. You have 15 minutes also for your presentation.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thank you very much to the organizers of this excellent conference. I'm very sorry not to be there in person, but I'm glad to make a contribution this way, and hopefully in the future I can attend and visit Amman again. The topic of the EU and Jordan, I'm going to take this from the UK perspective, which might be somewhat counterintuitive given that the UK is no longer in the EU, but I think it's still relevant. So allow me perhaps to take this in the following manner. First, I'll have a little look at how the UK currently looks at the Middle East region and how the UK within that looks at Jordan. From there, a little segue to the UK and Europe, and then to the UK and Europe into the Middle East and into Jordan. So I think firstly, it's important to note that the UK is in a moment of a reset of its foreign policy. That's not necessarily something particularly different from many other countries, especially given the fact that we're just coming out of hopefully coming out of a pandemic. We have left 4 years of Trump behind us, or perhaps at least in a sort of interlude of American foreign policy that seems somewhat more familiar from the past. But in the UK's case, that sort of moment of reset, I think, is of course bigger because of Brexit. So the UK is in the midst of trying to define its role in the world. The government has announced this idea of global Britain, but that slogan still needs to be filled with meaning. And I think it will take quite a while for that to actually happen. We have sort of beginning indications of where things are headed. We've got the integrated review from last year, which has sort of a few big picture items in it. One of them has already been mentioned. It's this Indo-Pacific tilt, the desire in London to effectively join the Americans in rebalancing foreign policy away from the Middle East and towards the Indo-Pacific. And I think the second big picture sort of takeaway from the integrated review is that the UK wants to position itself as a leader in climate change. And I'll come back to in a minute how I think that might be relevant for its engagement with the Middle East. Now, on the Middle East, the integrated review is actually fairly slim. There is quite clearly a sort of idea to want to do less, to certainly draw a clear line under, you know, the sort of interventionism of the first 11, 12 years of the century. But otherwise, it effectively kicks the can down the road a little bit in terms of how the UK defines its engagement with the Middle East. There's supposed to be a Middle East strategy coming out. I hear that it may be sometime this year, it might be early next year. But there are a few things in the integrated review that might give us an indication of where things are headed. And I think one of those is that Jordan and Oman are identified as the UK's sort of primary entry points to the region. I think it has, in my view, correctly identified Jordan and Oman as the two countries with which the UK has the closest relations. And by closeness, I don't mean that defined in terms of trade volumes or even, you know, military deployments, but I mean that more in a sort of emotional relationship in a way. At least that's the sense in London. It will be, of course, interesting to hear what our Jordanian colleagues think of that. But yeah, I think it makes sense. And I think it makes sense in the way that the UK is also recognizing that it's not just enough to have this idea of a Gulf strategy, that it just needs to figure out a way to make ever more money from its relationship with the Gulf, especially as it leaves the EU, but rather that it also needs to engage with the Middle East at a different level. And I'm not telling anyone here, any particular secrets when I say that engagement with Jordan and Oman is not primarily about economics, right? There is something very clearly different in those relationships. And so I think we have the promise of what could be a strategic approach. That strategic approach still needs to be filled with context and content. But I think that is something that at this moment we can only speculate about, and we'll simply have to wait and see what comes out of that. Now, I think throughout all of that, there is, like I said, this question of to what extent will the Middle East be a priority? And I think the signal, at least in the introductory review, is very clear that it shouldn't be the priority. It wants to be the Indo-Pacific. But one only has to look at a map to see that the Middle East is kind of in the middle, right? On the middle between the UK and the Indo-Pacific. So the Middle East will remain important to the UK without a doubt. And the second one is climate change from the introductory review. And on that one too, I think the Middle East is clearly an area where where if you want to focus on climate change around the world, you can't avoid dealing with the Middle East, right? On the one hand, that's where most of, or still a substantial amount of fossil fuels of this world are produced, on the one hand. On the other hand, I think the Middle East is also one of the regions where the effects of climate change are most clearly felt. And Paul has just spoken very effectively to at least the water issue, outlining how Jordan is clearly affected by those issues too. Now, I think with those two priorities, so the Indo-Pacific and therefore the Middle East, that's sort of this bridge region, and the second being climate change, what role Jordan plays in that for the UK, I think is perhaps slightly less clear than Oman might play, right? Oman is quite clearly, with its geographic location on the edge of the Gulf, there's very clear sort of midpoint, whereas Jordan, of course, is not a maritime power or a big maritime location in that sense. But Jordan is at the center of the Middle East, and I think that's perhaps where the UK and Jordan can develop their relationship further, where the UK can, in a way, find ways of benefiting from its relationship with Jordan in a way that it hasn't in the past, to get a better understanding of what the dynamics in the Middle East are these days, because the Middle East is shifting and dynamics are shifting, as I'm sure has been discussed in this conference at length. So now let me turn to the way of how I think that's relevant for European Jordanian relationships and ultimately EU Jordanian relations. I'm not going to look at it so much from the economic space. I think that has been very well covered, but from sort of geostrategic view. It's clear to me that for Europe, the Middle East will always remain relevant, whether you want it or not. And we had a few comments earlier about this question of, to what extent more populist governments might change that. But I actually agree with the view that the Middle East will always remain critical to Europe simply because of geography. That makes it also very different from the Americans, who are simply further away. So once Brexit has settled, I think, and we've dealt with fishery conflicts in the channels and so on, I think there is real scope for the UK and Europe to come back together as it comes to engagement with the Middle East. Engagement with the Middle East is one of the UK's main strengths when compared to the foreign policy strengths of European countries, right? Sure, France has also a long history and a substantial engagement in the Middle East, but I actually think that compared to the UK, it is still secondary. And Germany, which might want to expand its relationship with the Middle East, simply has a lot of ground to make up. So for those three countries, for UK, for Germany, for France to work together in an E3 context or within a European EU context simply makes sense. And I think once we get over the Brexit challenges, we might once again come back to some more pragmatic approaches. So perhaps I can close with what I think might be an appeal for, yes, for the UK and for Jordan, but also for us in the sort of analytic community. I think just as the UK needs to redefine its role in the Middle East, and like I said, I think Jordan can play a really, really critical role in that. I also think that Jordan has some redefining to do too. with the region changing substantially and having changed substantially over the last 10 years or so, whether that be through conflict in Jordan, in neighboring countries, or whether that be through diplomatic agreements like the Abraham Accords or a potential JCPOA 2.0, things are shifting. And I think Jordan within that also needs to redefine its position. And I think in that, Jordan has substantial strength, not just its geographic location, but also the fact that, you know, by now, if we just look at the sort of the landscape of the region, King Abdullah is now the elder statesman of the Middle East, right? He has and I think that gives Jordan a position to really help the engagement of external powers, and that includes the UK, that includes the EU, that includes the United States, and ultimately also includes Russia and China, to engage with the Middle East. And so, as the you know, in a way, I see this as, you know, Europe, the UK is still, you know, the biggest kingdom in Europe, and I think Jordan is still the central kingdom in the Middle East, and therefore I think those relations, that bilateral relationship, can also be a catalyst for better multilateral engagement between the Middle East and Europe. That much from me. I look forward to some questions and discussion.
شكرا جزيلا توبياس على هذه المداخلة وعلى توضيح ما يمكن للأردن وبريطانيا بشكل خاص في ضوء العلاقات التاريخية أن تفعله في اللحظة الراهنة أو في المستقبل. يعني الانطباع السائد في المنطقة أنه حتى عندما كانت بريطانيا عضواً فاعلاً في الاتحاد الأوروبي كانت ميولها أطلسية أكثر منها أوروبية بشكل أو بآخر، ترانس أتلانتيك. الآن بعد البريكزيت يعني الاعتقاد الأكثر يعني تجذراً ورسوخاً أنه بالذات بعد صفقة الغواصات وأوكس، يعني بريطانيا ربما تكون يعني أكثر بالفلك الأمريكي منها بالفلك الأوروبي، وهذا له ربما يعني انعكاسات يعني سياسية على مقارباتها لملفات المنطقة. قد لا يكون الأمر علاقة مباشرة بالعلاقات الأردنية الثنائية مع بريطانيا، ولكن فيما يخص الموقف البريطاني من أزمات المنطقة اللي الأردن يجد نفسه على تماس مباشر معها، من العلاقات الأردنية البريطانية إلى العلاقات الأردنية الألمانية. ومحدثنا الرابع هو إدموند رادكا. الدكتور إدموند رادكا هو الممثل المقيم لمؤسسة كونراد أديناور في الأردن. 15 دقيقة دكتور إدموند.
Thank you, dear Raib. As you said in the beginning, it's unusual that the representative of CAS is a panelist himself. But all the colleagues and contacts and friends in Germany were not available, so I volunteered to speak about Germany. But I'm speaking here as a political analyst, not on behalf of Germany. I want to help us to understand German foreign policy. I don't want to justify it. And a second preliminary remark, when we were setting up this conference, Al-Quds and Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, I was arguing to shorten the program and not having this session so late. With you being here, you see that I could not overcome the resistance of the Al-Quds Center. And I think to punish me, or I put me as a last speaker now. So I take my lesson from that, and I hope you bear with me for the last presentation for this very long day. I speak about Germany because I think a German perspective is important, but also because I think, and I say that under the, with apologies to our colleagues from the EU embassy, I think European foreign policy is driven still by the member states, if you like it or not. I think the questions have been discussed a lot. I will be a bit more principled, explaining, analyzing German foreign policy in 3 steps. I speak about the German foreign policy identity in general, second about Germany and the Middle East, and third about Germany and Jordan. Each time speaking about the tradition of German foreign policy and the trend. That's exactly what we want to do in this conference and how they might then affect Jordan. if you want to understand the foreign policy of Germany, or like if you want to understand the Federal Republic of Germany in general, we wanted to be the exact contrary of what we used to be in the first half of the last century. And that means our foreign policy is conceived in a reverse image to Nazi Germany, of course, but also to the Imperial Germany that we have experienced, and that led to 2 world wars. This is very much still our foreign policy mindset, with 2 main lessons drawn from this past experience. Never again, meaning never again war, and never alone, meaning a German tendency to favor multilateralism. Political scientists have developed a concept called civilian power to describe this German foreign policy of military restraint and multilateralism. Less benign analysts have said Germany just wants to be a big Switzerland, which is a bit difficult if you are economically the most powerful and most populous country in the EU and one of the world's main economic powerhouses. This foreign policy tradition has been challenged since 1990. With the reunification, the end of the Cold War, the expectations of our partners have changed. There is a famous speech of the then US President George Bush Sr. at the eve of German reunification, where he proposed to us being partners in leadership. Many Germans didn't want to hear that because we did quite well with our very defensive foreign policy. And even more famously, 2011, the then Polish foreign minister gave a speech in Berlin where he said, and I quote, "I fear German power less than German inaction." So ever since we're struggling to finding our role in the world, having internalized that we should have a very restrained foreign policy, at the same time assuming the responsibility that also our partners expect from us. In 2014, the Munich Security Conference, I'm glad that my hometown is mentioned so many times, is also played an important role again. In 2014, a new paradigm emerged. It's called the Munich Consensus in German foreign policy debates. And because at this conference, all important German leading politicians said, and in particular the president at the time, that Germany would take on more international responsibility and its action would be, I quote, earlier, more decisive, and more substantial. And indeed, since 2014, to give one example, 2014, the defense budget was 32 billion euro. Today, it's almost 15 billion euro. And, we've seen additional German troop deployments in Afghanistan and Mali and other places, including Lebanon. Even it's on the coast. It was the first time German troops were standing again in the Middle East. But this foreign policy role is not really accepted by everybody. So you have this new consensus. Germany has to do more within the foreign policy elite. But there's still a great reluctance of German public and some parts of the political spectrum to go along with it. So we end up sometimes with a muddling through. Taking on more responsibility, yes, but please take our money, not take our soldiers. And this gradual, more affirmative, but very slowly German policy we'll continue to see, even with a new government that will form at the end of the year and after the end of the era Merkel. So it's not likely to change. Germany and the Middle East. Our Anglo-Saxon friends are obviously all pivoting away from the Middle East. Since a decade, Germany is pivoting into the Middle East. And for reasons Dr. Alan has mentioned, it's geography. And if others are not taking care, it's in a neutral sense now. If Germany got the feeling of it's our neighborhood and things that are happening in the Middle East are affecting us. This came in 2 phases. The first one was the Arab Spring phase, 2010-2011, when Germans first realized this region is somehow alive, and the consensus in Germany at the time was, it's because we left this region, in particular to France. I'm speaking a bit more about North Africa now. We got into all these troubles with dictators and so on. Germany should take care of it. This was a moment of German emancipation, let's say, in the Middle East and North African region at the time. The second and more important shock came in 2015 with the refugee crisis, as it's called in Germany, and 1 million refugees coming within 1 year, mostly from the Middle East, from Syria. This shock within the German domestic landscape cannot be overestimated. It led to new parties, populism rising. You know, we see that even Brexit, it's because of this refugee crisis and so on, and Trump maybe also. You know, we put everything on this, if it's justified or not. There's a consensus in Germany to say that should never happen again. That's why we should take care of this region, or be interested in this region. Before the 2015 migration crisis, basically the only thing that was of interest to Germany in the Middle East was Israel. This is for obvious historic reason, and Angela Merkel, she is known for a speech that she gave in the Knesset in 2008, where she put a famous line that is now repeated day and day and day in Germany Middle Eastern policy debates. She said that Germany has a special historical responsibility for the security of Israel. And she moved on saying that this historic responsibility is, I quote, part of my country's reason of state, raison d'etat. She said that in the Knesset, and it has ever since then become a cornerstone of Germany's Middle Eastern policy. Since 2015, we added other interests, but if you ask an official from the Foreign Office what's Germany's main interest in the Middle East, he would still say the security of Israel. This is a challenge, of course, for Germany, because we like to have a human rights-oriented foreign policy, also with some values. That's why, we are supporting the Palestinians with money, basically, and sometimes with diplomacy. But and we are a very strong advocate of the two-state solution, has been mentioned several times now. Jordan is a very strong advocate, Germany too. I think that's why the Munich format came into existence. But I think, and you can say it's dead, but the Germans would never say the two-state solution is dead, because the mirage or the image or the illusion of a two-state solution is very needed for Germany. Because if you would acknowledge that it's not possible anymore, our relationship with Israel had to change. So we can always say occupation is temporary. It's not nice, but it's temporary. We support Palestinian statehood. But does Germany have the capacity and the willingness to influence Israel to move back? I don't know if they ever wanted, to orient Israel to a two-state solution? Maybe Germany would have at least partially the capacity. But do they have the willingness? No. And that's an interesting difference to the United States. I think, the other colleagues have spoken about changing discourse in the US, civil society movements. I don't see that in Germany. And the last Gaza war was a powerful reminder of that, where I think solidarity with Palestinians in Germany was very limited. And the problem in Germany is that this debate is very difficult to have because of the historic experience we have. And there's a confusion, a very big confusion about Zionism, anti-Zionism, occupation, anti-occupation, anti-Semitism, which makes it very difficult for Germany or for the German public to have a debate and to play a very powerful role when it comes to the Israel-Palestinian conflict, that goes beyond being a platform of dialogue. But when it comes to tough decisions, I think you cannot expect Germany to be on the forefront. You know, I might regret that personally, but I think that's the realistic assessment. What Germany has been doing, and when Germany feels much more comfortable when it comes to the Israel-Palestinian conflict, is working in multilateral forums. You know, we have been delegating somehow the Israel-Palestinian conflict to the EU already since the 70s. And that's why we feel comfortable in this kind of Munich formats, because then it's not Germany criticizing Israel, but it's somehow a multilateral forum underlining international law. Now that's then fine with German foreign policy. So I think yes, the Munich format and other formats. You know, when we look to German foreign policy, and including in the Middle East, we'll see much more multilateralism ad hoc. So what Tobias was saying, also UK, France, Germany. I think these are formats that Germany is very much comfortable with. And I think it's also much more efficient than working through the EU, where you have to get agreement of all 27 member states, and you have Poland, Hungary, you're playing very badly sometimes in this regard. So I think it's pretty efficient, and we've seen that in the past. Even as the UK was still member of the EU, when there were this kind of E3 statements, they were much more powerful and much more easier to have than EU unanimous declaration. It was mentioned by Raib and also by others, you know, about human rights and democracy. So in theory, Germany likes to emphasize that our foreign policy is also value-based, and I think there is a democracy aspect into that. But you know, we are when it comes to the Middle East in particular, in this kind of stability democracy dilemma. We want democracy, but we don't want democracy at the expense of stability. And I think in 2011 and the following years, Germany was very enthusiastic, thinking it could achieve stability in the Middle East through democracy. But I think 10 years after, this optimism has gone since a long while, and now we just want the region to be somehow stable. Even if we in the German foreign policy establishment believe still, I think that sustainable stability can only be achieved through good governance, inclusive political processes. That's why we have these foundations. That's why we have some clauses, some strings attached to development aid. But we're not pushing it. We're not pushing it powerfully because we are afraid of short-term instability. I come to an end. So. If I have 2 minutes about Jordan, I think the importance of Jordan has increased for Germany during the last decade. Why? Because of refugees. Because this country is still a producer of stability in the region, and because Jordan is a force for moderation and dialogue, and that is what Germany is, of course, very much in favor of in a region that where we see all these cleavages. You see it with really multiplication of development aid since the last decade, in particular for the Syrian refugees, but also for Jordan in general, and with increasing diplomatic engagement. The Munich format is one. I was myself working on the Israel-Palestine desk in Germany 2020 when the annexation debates happened. And when I was discussing with German parliamentarians about why we should oppose annexation, the most convincing argument I felt was it would destabilize Jordan. It's very hard to make a case for the Palestinians, but it's much easier to make a case for Jordan. So German-Jordan relations, I think, are on a solid base. Even if Angela Merkel is leaving, and she's known to have had a very close relationship with the king. Both countries are advocates for regional dialogue. I think Jordan should engage a little bit, as Paul also said, engage more, not only with German economy. I think there is still potential, but also with the broader public. The king is just meeting Angela Merkel, and that's it. Maybe some public relations would also be, could be something that Jordan could step up. We will have a new government in Germany. So the CDU-CSU for the first time in 16 years will be out of government. I think there's not much change to be expected. There might be a little bit more of a human rights emphasis, in particular if the Green Party takes over the foreign ministry, which is likely. So this kind of how much development aid do we give to countries that do not respect good governance and do not fight corruption might take also a little bit more emphasis, but I think in the long run we will not see major change between on German-Jordanian relations. Thank you.
شكرا إدموند على هذه المداخلة الصريحة والشفافة فيما يمكن وما لا يمكن لألمانيا أن تفعله في محددات السياسة الخارجية لألمانيا وفي تعريف مصالح ألمانيا في المنطقة والانتهاء بالإضاءة على العلاقات الأردنية الألمانية التي تطورت بشكل ملحوظ في الآونة الأخيرة وعلى مستويات عدة في هذا المجال. لدينا بحدود 30-40 دقيقة، نريد أسئلة ومداخلات سريعة من الحضور قبل أن نعود للمتحدثين لكلمات ختامية. من لديه القدرة على طرح سؤال أو مداخلة، من لديه الحيل والمروة في الأستاذ سمير صالحة ثم حضرتك وحضرتك. أيوه نعم.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. يعني أنا بدي أطرح سؤال ما بعرف إذا كان بدي أطرحه بشكل شمولي على جميع الأخوة اللي تحدثوا. وبسمع يعني إذا عندهم رأي أو تقييم. السؤال هو باختصار لو فينا نسمع قراءة مختصرة أو تحليل أو تقدير مختصر إذا في تباعد اليوم بين السياسات الأمريكية والأوروبية في التعامل مع الملفات التي تعطيها الأردن الأولوية على المستوى الإقليمي تحديداً. يعني المقصود هون بدنا نسمع كيف بتنظر أمريكا وأوروبا مثلاً لمقارنة بين صفقة القرن وهذا المشروع الجديد مبادرة الشام الجديدة، وين في تقارب وين في احتمال يصير في تباعد. شكراً سيد الرئيس.
شكراً دكتور سمير. دكتور علي الهيل على المايك. الله يخليك.
Edmund, my friend, I have a question for you. I really value highly the role played by Angela Merkel during her era in German politics, most notably what she did kindly to the migrants and especially the Syrian migrants, and the tolerance she performed for certain behaviors by some Syrian migrants, as you may gather. Why? But what I have observed this remark: why doesn't Germany and some other European countries in the EU compensate the Palestinians for the immense massacres Israel carried out against Palestinians since 1948 until this moment, until months ago in Gaza Strip, for example. I'm not going to mention these massacres, Deir Yassin, Sabra Shatila, blah, blah, blah. I know for certain that Germany compensates the Jew families in Palestine for what their ancestors experienced on the hand of the European Nazis beginning of the 1930s. I love to see an equal role played by Germany and some other Europeans countries, not just Germany, with that compensate the Israelis, but also some other European countries, needless to say, needless to mention the United States. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ali. Dr. Dia Al-Asadi.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. My question is first to Dr. Edmond, but also other colleagues can answer this question. To what extent are European decision makers free and independent in drawing their policies concerning the Middle East? To what extent they are independent from the American vision and American decision making? Because I have so many incidents where many decisions were changed under the pressure of the American vision. I mean, a case in point is Siemens deal in Iraq, a very big deal with the Iraqi government that was changed following the American interest in GE. So are these policies independent from the American framework and vision for the region? Thank you very much.
شكرا دكتور ضياء. دكتورة إلينا سلوبودينا.
Thank you. My question is for Edmond Radka. Could you provide a small picture about some differences between Christian democratic parties, Angela Merkel, and maybe could be new government of Olaf Scholz, especially that the Ministry of Defense of Germany, Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, she made several times very strange statements about, for example, Germany and Syria. She said even some years ago that you need to send some militaries to the north of Syria, and it was accepted in Russia with big astonishment and, frequently speaking, kind of humor. Is it how you explain these statements, and also what are the differences between two approaches? Thank you.
شكرا إلينا. أي أسئلة ملاحظات أخرى قبل ما ننتقل؟ تفضل إليوت.
شكرا. I was wondering that the UK and the US seems to be infected by this deep fear of China, and because of that they've completely pivoted away from the Middle East. Why hasn't the EU as a whole felt this same fear and had this same pivot, apart from the simple physical closeness with the Middle East?
Thank you, Elliot. تفضل.
Just to thank firstly Dr. Radka for his very transparent evaluation, and I would like him to confirm what I heard, that you said something like for Germany announcing basically the two-state solution dead is not a preferred situation because Germany cannot cope with it. Okay, thank you. But my question is for Dr. George. You mentioned that with regards to Syria, that the Jordan's approach or Jordan's initiative towards Syria might be sort of frowned upon by the EU because of the current sanctions and everything. What if this approach by Jordan wasn't really an individual approach? What would be the case should this approach by Jordan be in fact a spearhead of a sort of coalition of Arab states, whereby Jordan is taking a lead with the approval of those states and, as Dr. Rantawi said, an amber light from the United States? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ammar. Other questions, comments? Okay. 3 minutes for each of our speakers, starting from Dr. Alain.
I'll try 3 minutes.
4 minutes.
4 minutes. Good on you. Mr. Arabe mentioned after the conclusion of my address, the Iran rapprochement. I would stress, I understand very well that it's minuscule at the moment. I think I called it cautious and preliminary overtures. So I'm at one with you on that. On Syria, again, you mentioned at the outset the question of Jordan as a group. What I've got in mind is the nature of EU sanctions against Syria on the one hand, and the nature of the Syrian economy on the other. The Syrian economy is largely a patronage system, a political patronage system. The major corporations are controlled by relatives of or individuals loyal to the regime. I can understand cross-border trade between Jordan and Syria in vegetables, etc., at a low level would not be a problem. My point was that it's not difficult to imagine a wider opening, commercial opening, would start getting into big problems with those sanctions, and that could unsettle the EU relationship with Jordan. I think what you describe is, in a way, a different thing. If there was a coordinated effort by several Arab states, Jordan perhaps leading the way, with a green light or an amber light from Washington, aimed at some sort of comprehensive solution of the Syrian conflict, that would be a different situation. I was specifically looking at something that might rock the EU-Jordan relation over Syria. Human rights, democracy, also mentioned. Look, I certainly didn't come to Jordan to attack human rights in Jordan, and I think I mentioned in my address that the EU, in its website no less, mentions democracy, human rights, shared values. Regionally speaking, Jordan is a human rights paradise, but it's far from perfect. You just have to read the US human rights reports. There are dark areas in Jordan. The impressive thing about Jordan is how limited those dark areas are compared with all the neighbors. So there is a shared understanding of those values. Value is put on human rights, democracy, but it doesn't mean we're yet there. I think probably that's all I need to say for the moment. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Allen. Dr. Ball, 3-4 minutes, please.
I'll do my best, thank you. Thank you, Ustaz Rantawi. I will proceed sequentially. So for question one, is there a difference between European Union and United States portfolios of Jordan in the region? And I think that there are. If we look, for example, at the rules of origin, the rules of origin from the European Union to its southern partners in the Arab League contradict the rules of origin that exist for the United States in some cases. So there was a recent case where Morocco was forced, in effect, to make a decision between whether it received preferential access to the Eurozone or to US market opportunities for products produced in Morocco on that basis. As far as the security arrangement is concerned, I think there is a commonality, but as was mentioned in the previous session, given the United States pivot towards the Pacific and Asia and East Asia more generally, I do think that the US is more inclined to look at outsourcing than the European Union. I think the European Union, as was mentioned by my colleague Tobias, is geographically closer. So they're more, I think, looking forward, the European Union is more inclined to be more direct than perhaps the US. The second question regarding compensation for the Palestinians, why not? Purely on a let's just look at the procedural level to begin with. Compensation occurs after the fact. So maybe in the event of a resolution to the Israeli occupation of Palestinian land, as part of particularly the refugee settlement, their compensation will come into play. However, whilst the conflict remains stuck in this status quo, dead in the water as it's been called, I don't see any appetite for a kind of compensation to be procured, regardless of the obvious morality of such a thing. Question 3, to what extent are European decision makers independent from US decision makers? With that question, I think we need to distinguish between, again, economic decision making in terms of agreements, and I've touched on that already, with the political. And again, I think there's a common thread which may help to answer why, for example, Germany and France haven't recognized Palestine as a state, whereas other European nations have, such as Sweden, for example. Sweden recognized Palestine in 2014. So that's kind of one area, I think, where the core part of Europe at some point may have to follow the American line. Now, how much Russia and the fear of Russia turning off the gas tap to Europe figures in all of this, I don't know, not being a European scholar, but that may be part of it. And the fifth question, why doesn't the European Union pivot towards China? Geography plays a role, of course, in that. I think also this Anglosphere idea plays a role. Keep in mind, AUKUS is the United States, England, and Australia, all of whom are Anglo states. Now, that doesn't mean that other states might join in the containment of China. There's the Quartet, for example, in the Pacific that includes Australia, India, Japan, and the United States. But the European Union has also, I think, begun to push back against Chinese influence with regards to infrastructure tied to the Belt and Roads Initiative. And there's a lot more discussion in Europe now about the negative effects of that. But how far that goes into the future, I do not know at this stage. And that's my response.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you so much. Tobias. Tobias, do you hear me?
Thank you for those questions. Yeah, thank you. I think I'll focus on this question of the differences between the European and American approaches, or perhaps even similarities. I think there is a substantial, it's all part of what I would argue is a substantial shift in geopolitics. And if it is anywhere particularly obvious, it's in the Middle East, and it's in how the quote unquote West, which includes the United States and Europe, approach the region. And I think as that shift is ongoing, it's all about interests, right? And it's about what are the vital interests. And I think if you look at the US, those vital interests are changing. But I don't need to go into depth of that because I think that has been discussed in the previous session. And when it comes to Europe, there now has to be a look at what are the interests, right? And I think the interests are, on the one hand, based on security, and that is a very broad basket that includes, yes, terrorism, but also I think the question of migration is a securitized one as well. It includes economic interests, and it includes geopolitical interests, right? And I think those interests are, and I think I hope I made that clear in my presentation, those interests are different from those of the United States. And I think the main difference in that is geography. It's simply closer. And that, by the way, also accounts for the United Kingdom. Whilst Brexit has occurred, it has not removed the United Kingdom out of Europe, just out of the European Union. And that's why I think that sort of engagement, like Edmund also pointed out, on a sort of trilateral basis, bilateral basis between London, Paris, Berlin, and others will continue. Now, in terms of what the differences are in terms of visions from Europe or the US towards the Middle East, I would argue there are no visions at this point. I don't think there is an American vision for the Middle East at this point, nor is there a European one, nor is there a German, French, or British one. because I think in all of those there is an ongoing change of how we sitting in European capitals see the region and how we see the region within the sort of global shifting strategic environment. So I think what I tried to outline is sort of in the UK, I think there's sort of a very beginning process of identifying what a vision is for the UK's role in the world. And within that, inevitably, there's going to have to be some content on what the role is for the UK and the Middle East too. I think at this point, there are no visions. There are a few constants. And I think they will continue as it goes forward. For the UK, it will forever look west first to the US before it looks anywhere else. And I would argue that for much of Europe, that will also continue for a while. And therefore, we can always expect a sort of reasonably close alignment across the Atlantic towards the Middle East. Sure, when we have administrations like the Trump administration in Washington, that distance will grow. When we have administrations like the Biden administration, that distance will close once again. But otherwise, I think that alignment will remain. The extent to which one dictates the other, I think, is just going to shift from issue to issue. I think the other constant is that the relationship between European countries and Israel will remain close and will continue to remain so. I mean, I don't see a substantial, I think for Germany it's most obvious, as Edmund has pointed out, but I also think for other European countries, they will continue to see Israel as a close partner and a close friend. And that will shape ways in which engagement with the rest of the region happens. And then finally, I think there's also a constant in terms of engaging with some of the other concerns. I think there will continue to be a concern about Iran and its role in the region. There will still be a concern about Syria. And so I think Europe will remain skeptical as it comes to re-engagement with Damascus. I do think that sort of yellow flag that was approached, that was outlined earlier, is probably most likely a sort of not complete opposition to re-engagement with Damascus by other actors, including Jordan, but certainly not sort of cheering from the sidelines or even active engagement with that process itself. So I think that my main takeaway here is there are no visions anywhere in Europe or the US. There's ongoing thinking and shifting views of what role European countries want to play in the region and how the Middle East features in a wider changing global strategic environment.
Thank you, Tobias. Edmund, since many questions directed to you personally, we can give you an extra 2 minutes if you want.
Yeah, that would be nice. And you wrote on the agenda 6:30, so I have even okay. Yeah, thank you for all these pertinent questions. Colleagues have made, I try to be as complimentary as possible to what my colleague said. The difference is US and EU. Deal of the century was vehemently opposed by Germany. As much as I said, we are always a tendency to be behind Israel, that was too much. The deal of the century, we disagreed. And with the annexation, we very much disagreed. Because annexation was just too much. Let's say incremental secret annexation is one thing, but formal annexation would have been very difficult for Germany. Because how would you justify of doing nothing if Israel is annexing illegally land it occupies, if at the same time you make sanctions against Russia, what we consider the annexation of Crimea? It would not have been sustainable. So that's why Germany was so vehemently, please do, just please no annexation.
We don't name it annexation.
That's what I was saying, what we consider. I know exactly. I just was drawing the parallel. I don't want to qualify these, the coming back of Crimea. So that's a different issue. It would have been difficult for us to sustain sanctions against Russia for what happened with Crimea and doing nothing through Israeli annexation. I think that's the red line. And I think that's why we need a two-state solution, because occupation has to be temporary. Otherwise, it's really difficult to combine with the Germans' approach. This is a very fragile position, morally, sure, but also politically. And I don't know, in the long run, if the narrative changes, what we've seen coming from the United States, the Palestinian youth movement very much connecting the Palestinian cause to human rights and citizenship, away from the old narrative that we know of statehood and so on. It will be much more difficult for Germany to continue its position as it is. So I'm curious to say, and personally, I hope that Germany will take a path of morality in its foreign policy. Second, Syria. I don't know, red flag or orange flag from the US. In Germany, there's no appetite at all. Germany does not handing out flags to other countries. Maybe that's different from the US. There's no appetite at all in Germany to normalize relations with Syria. The only political element in Germany who wants to do that is the extreme right wing, because they want to send the refugees back. So indeed, that might lead to some tough discussions with Jordan. I don't see that this will change in the near future, that we would normalize or engage in reconstruction as long as the Assad regime is not changing, which they didn't do for the last 10 years. Why should they do it now? Compensating the Palestinians, this is a very big issue. Like, this should be a proper seminar, the German relationship with the Middle East conflict. I think we somehow, the amount of support we provided to Palestinians in terms of support for the PA, for instance, UNRWA and so on, is somehow a kind of compensation. But I think, what matters for the Palestinians is not compensation in terms of money. I think what is interesting for the Palestinians is political support. And that's what they do not get from Germany, for reasons I have just mentioned, or at least not enough. I think, Germany has its history with the Jewish people, and we have to deal with it, and we can deal with it. The problem is that should not negatively impact the Palestinians. That's the problem. I think we can deal with our history, but the problem is it's intertwined with the Palestinian cause. And that's indeed a big problem. Are we independent from the US? Militarily, no. And it was powerfully straight in your face with the Afghanistan disaster. We are not able to secure, we the Europeans, are not able to secure an airport one day without American support. So militarily, we are completely dependent. I don't see that changing anytime soon. Diplomatically, I think it's moving. So in theaters where there's heavy military involvement, like in Iraq, I think, of course, the American influence is very big on us. If we are involved only diplomatically, I think we're getting much stronger and we're getting more independent. For instance, when it comes to Germany, we played a very forward-going role in Libya. We didn't wait, for US approval. We just did it, like with the Berlin process, because there was less military involved. And you see the last few years, what you're saying, I think, was more true in the past. We see a slight tendency in the last few years of Germany and Europe striving for more autonomy from the US. There was a famous speech of Angela Merkel in a Bavarian beer hall. I don't know why she did that in this, at this place, where she said, Trump, it was after the election of Trump, she said, we have to learn that we have to count on ourselves a little bit, or stop counting on others. And I think Trump and Brexit came really as a reality shock for Germany. The US is not reliable, And the EU is not a self-fulfilling prophecy because the UK, you know, our old friend, they left. So I think now, and you know, Macron is pushing it, European autonomy, European sovereignty. It's also somehow getting traction in Germany. It will take some time, but the tendency is there. But we don't have, by far, we don't have the military capacity to underline this, this ambition. This leads me a bit to your question about the differences, because the Christian Democrats are the most transatlantic party, political party in Germany. Also the others are, you know, the three parties that are likely to form the new government, so the Social Democrats, the Greens, and the Liberals, are also somehow, of course, you know, pro-Western or in the Western camp. But the CDU, I think, was especially transatlantic. They're out of government now. They will be out of government next year, most probably. So I think this kind of trend will rather continue. Of emancipation from the United States. And, you know, I tried to explain in the first part of my presentation this kind of soul-searching of Germany. It's still going on. And I think some incidents you meant with, you know, that our defense minister wanted to send troops to Syria. Not only you were astonished, also we were astonished. I was also working in Berlin at the time. Nobody knew about it. It was not coordinated with the foreign ministry, for instance. And it didn't happen finally, of course. But that shows how, you know, we want to take an international role, but we don't know exactly how to do it because we never learned it. So I think you'll see this kind of moving maybe too much, too little. I think it's a sign of immaturity of our foreign policy. Because 30 years now that we are a reunified sovereign country, fully sovereign country in the heart of Europe. But I think foreign policy takes time to learn it and to develop. Lastly, just to add one more factor to why there is no pivot away from the Middle East, from Germany or from other European countries. Geography was mentioned, migration, terrorism, you know, there are interests here in the region. I want to add one more thing, and that's demography. You know, don't forget that in Europe are living millions of people who have roots in the Middle East. In particular, North Africans and you know, Maghrébins in France, but in Germany we have millions of Turkish people, and since 2015 we also have 1 million Syrians in Germany. And as I said, you know, we're not expecting for them to go back anytime soon. So that means the conflicts of the Middle East are also affecting us internally. And we've seen that with the last Gaza war. There were pro-Palestinian demonstrations, in particular by migrants. And then others, I was very curious, then right extremists were demonstrating in favor of Israel, you know, because, you know, they thought, you know, it's against the Muslims. So it's a very complicated issue. What I want to say is that the demographics also lead to a connection to the Middle East that we cannot dissociate us. So to conclude, I think our destinies, you know, if I may say that a bit, you know, are intertwined. We cannot separate us from the Middle East. You cannot build walls as high as people would not go, and we have already people of the Middle East living with us or living as citizens of our states. So I think Germany, France, UK, Europe will be engaged in the Middle East, but we also should limit our expectations. In particular with Corona, I think in particular what was mentioned also for the US by Besma and others. I think there will be a priority of building at home in the very short future. You know, so much money was spent for Corona, it will be much more difficult to justify development aid in the future. So we see how it goes, but I think Europe will, continental Europe will rather pivot into the Middle East than away from it. Thank you.
Thank you, Edmond. I would like, at the end of the session, to thank deeply the speakers, Alain, Paul, Tobias, and Edmond, for their insightful presentations and for their honest presentation, which gave us a more deeper analysis and understanding about Europe at large, and Middle East at large, especially with a special focus on Jordan. I would like also to thank participants for their patience. It had been a very long day, promising that tomorrow we will have a lot of hot potatoes on the table. We have Turkey, Iran, Syria, Iraq, Russia, Egypt as well. We have tomorrow a very interesting sessions, but by the way, about this third session, which is, I know it's a very busy day, very difficult day. We have two options, whether to have a 3 days conference with 2 sessions a day, but I am not quite sure that you have time to stay here for a 3 days conference, or to have a 2 days conference with 3 sessions a day. But we will never compromise any of our sessions because we deeply feel that they are very much important and linked to our top priorities as a country and as a region at large. Thank you so much, and see you tomorrow at 10 o'clock in the morning. Have a nice day.